Hey everybody, this is Samantha Claire Snyder. I'm a musician, a mathematician, and a storyteller, and this is my fantasy novel, The Map of Griffyngrein.
Chapter 6. So, you've changed your mind, Axman said quietly. Golgotha had brought them safely through the forest, back to the very trail from which they had fled. Along the way, he had explained to Jane and Jason in no uncertain terms that, had they run further or in a different direction, they almost certainly would have ended up in the hands of the Terfungs. Now they stood facing the two hookies. Axman looked grave, but not as angry as they had expected, and Jerem seemed relieved to see them. "Yes, we have," Jane said. "It was stupid to run away," Jason said. "We should have stayed and talked it through." "Everyone's nervous when they're about to take the test," Jerem said. "I'm just glad you didn't run into trouble." "Does this mean you're going to take the test?" Axman asked. "Yes, it does." "Well, then we should be on our way. The Terfungs usually avoid the tower and its surroundings nowadays, but it's best not to take any chances." There was nothing more to be said. They set off down the trail, while Jane and Jason tried to ignore the butterflies in their stomachs. This was really happening, and there was nothing to stop it now. They moved quickly, and soon began to notice many ruined remains of buildings on either side of the path. Then the landscape began to slope noticeably upwards. "We're in what used to be the capital city," Axman said, climbing the hill on which the castle once stood. "The tower is on the other side of this thicket." In a moment they found themselves standing in a clearing so large the trees could not meet overhead and choke out a view of the sky. It was cloudy, but the daylight was a relief after the gloominess of the woods. The whole of this clearing was scattered with broken pieces of stone. Here and there, a chunk of a wall was still standing, looking as if it could tumble over at any moment, and even amongst the weeds one could see bits of beautiful stonework. It must have been a splendid castle once, but now it lay crushed on the ground, torn apart by malicious hands and a harsh environment. All except for the tower. There it stood, like a sentinel over that graveyard clearing, proud and lofty, soaring high above the trees around it. Clearly it was very old, and in places vines clung to it, but the years had only added to its mysterious majesty. It was built of very handsome stone, similar to granite. It was a cool gray color, flecked with shimmering bits of blue and silver. The sides of the circular tower were smooth and without embellishment, with simple slits cut in the walls to let the light in. This simplicity helped to highlight the beauty of the elaborate cornice just below the battlements. The longer they stood looking at the ruins and at the tower, the more they could sense the magic and history permeating it all. The air seemed to be tingling with the presence of events and people that were long gone but somehow still very real. They heard voices, dreamlike and far away, yet very clear. Someone laughed. It was a lovely laugh, a lady's laugh. Then they saw, in the midst of the ruins to the left of the tower, the misty figure of a man, broad-shouldered and bearded, clothed in vivid royal purples. He gave a sweeping bow, kissing the hand of the beautiful woman who stood before him. As these visions faded away, they heard the chatter of many voices and the clatter of dishes and silverware. There was a long table, around which were seated many men and women and curious creatures, feasting merrily. They could even smell the scrumptious food, as the steam from the bowls and platters wafted towards them in the breeze. A young man with a magnificent crown on his head, seated at the end of the table, rose and proposed a toast, and everyone raised their glasses, and that vision disappeared as well. Then they saw several ladies in fine gowns, seated close together in a little semicircle of high-backed chairs in front of a roaring fire, weaving and talking quietly with one another. Finally, the crowning vision came, a huge winged shape. Its figure wasn't quite clear, but they could tell from the glimmer in the air and the tingling in their scalps that it was a magnificent beast. Several people were gathered around it. A young girl was trying to throw her small arms around its great neck. An older man and woman were bowing courteously to it, and a boy was dancing around it excitedly. At last, this vision faded, and all was quiet. All 5 of the spectators drew a deep breath. "This is incredible," Jane whispered reverently. They stood in silence, looking at the ruins for a moment longer, and then Axman stepped forward. "Come on, we're on a mission." They picked their way through the ruins towards the tower. When they reached it, they circled to the right until they found the door. It was massive, made of a heavy dark wood with a rich red tint, ornately carved and bearing no signs of damage or decay. Axman drew a cluster of keys out from under his shirt. They were hanging from a leather cord around his neck. From these he chose the largest one and thrust it into the lock. There was a click, and the door groaned open. "Where did you get that?" Jason asked in astonishment. Axman grinned. Long story. They walked slowly and softly into the tower. When they were inside, Axman shut the door and locked it. It was very, very quiet in the tower. They all spoke in low voices and made as little noise with their movements as possible. The extreme solemnity of the place demanded it. The room in which they stood was bare and simple. There were no furnishings or tapestries or architectural designs. Like all rooms in the tower, it was about 20 feet in diameter. The winding stone staircase started just a few feet from the door and wound clockwise, taking up most of the room. There was a strange feature to this staircase. Against the wall, a narrow set of much smaller stairs had been built in sync with it, 3 steps to each step of the main staircase. Golgotha went to these, and Jane and Jason realized that the tower had been designed to accommodate both man and griffin man. They all began climbing the stairs. They went up 12 steps, came to a small landing, and then climbed 12 more. At this next landing, they all paused for a moment before a life-size stone statue of a man that stood against the wall. It was startlingly realistic. The man was slightly taller than Jason. His clean-shaven face was stern but handsome, and his hand rested on the hilt of a long sword. "Who is that?" Jane asked. Axman jerked his head towards Jerem. "Get him to explain it to you. He has all the history of our kingdom that he can scrape up locked into his brain and can tell it better than I can." "Oh, that's King Beryl the Fearless, the third king of Griffyngrein," Jerem said. "He defeated our kingdom's first great enemy, the Reapers. They were fearful creatures. From the waist up, they looked like men, only with deadly fangs, and from the waist down, they were serpents. They invaded the western side of Griffyngrein and were an awful menace to the people as they crept further east. But Beryl was a skillful strategist and a bold warrior. In the end, he wiped most of the Reapers out and drove the rest from the continent. They say he fought tirelessly, always on the front lines, leading his troops by example. He was bitten by one of the creatures during the last battle, but he still pushed onward and led his army to victory. He died the night afterwards." Jane gazed at the statue. "He's young," she said softly, studying the face. "He was 27 when he died." At the next landing, there was another statue. This man looked older. He was also clean-shaven. There were creases around his eyes, as if he smiled often, but his general expression was serious and noble. "Beryl's father, King Norman, the second king of Griffyngrein," Jerem explained. "He was very kind and very wise. He wasn't as much of a warrior as his son would be, the times didn't call for it, but he did a lot to establish order in the kingdom, politically and economically. By the time he passed away of old age, the kingdom's tribes were strongly united under his rule, living in peace with him and with one another." The next flight ended in a circular room, the highest room inside the tower. Against the wall immediately to their left, another life-size statue stood. This man was barrel-chested, broad-shouldered, and muscular, and his face was merry and brave. He looked full of joy just to be alive. He had a thick, short-trimmed beard and a mustache. He was about Jason's height. In one hand he gripped a large double-bladed battle-axe that leaned against his shoulder, and in the other he bore a staff with a flag rippling from it. Axman, Golgotha, and Jerem smiled fondly as they looked upon the statue. "That, Jane and Jason, is His Majesty King Orwin, the father of Griffyngrein. He was from a kingdom called Aria, which lay far across the sea to the east of our land. He was the twin brother of the Aryan king. Orwin was a quick-witted, compassionate man who aided his brother greatly, but the urge for adventure and discovery was strong in his blood. He had dreams of setting sail and seeking out the famous but elusive Timber Island, about which he had heard many seafaring rumors. For years, old sailors had told tales of a mystical island thick with exotic trees and home to strange inhabitants, and Orwin wanted to find it. Finally, when he was 32 years old, with his father's blessing, he set out with a small, sturdy fleet to search out the island. After many adventures, he did discover land in the area of the famed island, but he soon found out that Timber Island was not an island at all. It was a continent. It was a beautiful land, lush with trees, nice strong hardwood trees, and apparently unoccupied. Orwin planted the royal flag in the soil and returned home to gather settlers. When they arrived for the second time and began to establish themselves in the land, they discovered they weren't alone. But surprisingly, this turned out to their advantage. "Rain have told him that part of the story," Golgotha interjected. Jerem grinned. "I figured he did." All the same, I'd like to hear more of Griffyngrein's story," Jason said. "And you will, but this isn't the time or place for it," Jerem said. "I'll tell you all you want to hear later, at least as much as I know, which isn't as much as I would like." They now turned their attention to the rest of the room. A few feet to the right of the door there stood a white marble table. A pedestal rose from the center, of one and the same piece as the table. In this pedestal was set the largest gem Jane and Jason had ever seen. It was about 9 inches in diameter, a cool blue color, and very beautiful. But somehow it didn't sparkle and flash into light as would be expected. It was as if its brilliancy was muted somehow. "This is the Bondstone," Axman said. "It's amazing," Jane said. "It really is, but I don't know," Jason said, peering at it closely. "Something's off about it." Jerem sighed. "That's an understatement. They say it used to have the most dazzling light you can imagine, just radiating out of it. But the light went out when King Oglen claimed it and broke the covenant. It sits waiting for the throne to be taken back by a true leader who will restore the alliance." "But I'm confused," Jason said. "Rain have told us that the Terrafungs have plundered Griffyngrein pretty thoroughly. Why haven't they taken the stone? It's obviously valuable, and it'd be hard for them to miss." Axman grinned. "Didn't you see the big heavy door we had to unlock down there?" "Yes, but why haven't they beaten or chopped that down? It's only wood." Golgoth laughed. "Only wood." That's what they thought, too. They'd heard of the Bondstone, of course, and you figure right, Jason. They wanted to get at it badly. Over the years, they've chopped, battered, stabbed, and even tried fire, but that door is as solid and handsome as it was the day it was made. Magic, of course. "This whole tower is held together by something more powerful than mortar," Axman said gravely. "You'll understand that even more in a moment." Finally, they tore their gaze away from the stone and looked around the rest of the room. There were no other adornments or special features about it, except for a massive stone column that rose from the floor to the ceiling in the center of the room. There was a doorway in this column, showing a hollow interior that was large enough to hold 2 people standing side by side. Axman, Golgoth, and Jerem all turned to Jane and Jason now, with anticipation in their eyes. "Now it's time for the tower test," Jerem said quietly. Jane and Jason both took a deep breath, the butterflies in their stomachs intensifying. "Tell us what we need to do," Jason said. "You must step inside that column, both of you, together." Jane and Jason obeyed. In a moment, they were standing within the column. Its stone floor was intricately patterned with vines, leaves, fruits, and flowers. The ceiling, about 4 feet above their heads, was engraved in a similar manner. Jane and Jason both turned around and faced the doorway. Jerem, Axman, and Golgoth were all standing together, near the Bondstone, watching them closely. "What now?" Jane asked. "Look above the doorway of the column," Jerem said. "Do you see any words written there?" They looked. At first it was hard to tell, for the engraving was especially complicated there. But the more they studied, the clearer the words became. "Yes, I do," Jason said. "So do I," Jane added. The 3 Griffyngrites looked at each other with suppressed excitement. "What do the words say?" asked Jerem. His voice was trembling and sounded strange. "Read them aloud. Read them together." Jane and Jason looked hard and spoke slowly, of one accord. "The map of Griffyngrein has called. We have answered. A revolution is at hand." There was a flash. Suddenly the words they had just read were filled with an extremely bright, silvery light. The patterns on the floor and ceiling were traced with it too. Rapidly, the effect began to outline the entire column in which they stood. Jane and Jason felt an invigorating, almost stinging thrill throughout their bodies. The 3 onlookers saw the silver line shoot around the 2 Americans' profiles. Then, the whole inside of the column suddenly flooded with the light. From there, it shot out in a powerful stream and struck the Bondstone. There was a loud crack of thunder. The great gem blazed with blinding splendor. Another stream of the light sprang up from the gem to meet the roof of the tower room, and rapidly it began to outline its every stone. This spread swiftly from the roof to the walls and from the walls to the floor, until it looked as if the very mortar of the tower was made of molten silver. The whole structure began to tremble. Jerem grabbed Axman by the shoulder, his eyes wide and swimming with tears. "They're the ones, Axman! They're the ones!" was all he could say. "Well, what do you know?" Golgoth breathed, shaking his head slowly. "Look," Axman said, pointing at the column. The light was not as overwhelming there as before. They could see the silhouettes of the 2 inside. As they looked, the floor of the column began to rise up. Jane and Jason grabbed hold of each other, thinking they would bash their heads against the ceiling and bracing for impact. But they never felt it. When they looked up, the ceiling of the column had disappeared, and they were rising up through the opening into the fresh air above. Moments later they had come all the way through, and the stone circle in which they stood had locked into the new level. The shaking came to a halt. They looked around and realized that they were standing in the top of the tower. They stepped forward and looked out over the battlements. The canopy of the forest was right below them. The sun was shining, and they heard birds singing for the first time since they had arrived in Griffyngrein. There was a noise behind them, and they turned to see the platform on which they had risen flip open like a trapdoor. Jerem climbed through the opening, beaming. Axman came behind him, and lastly, Golgoth clambered through. Once they had closed the trapdoor, they all dropped down on one knee before Jason and Jane. "You have passed the test," Jerem said, "and the three of us humbly give you our allegiance. This is a great day for Griffyngrein." Chapter 7. Home is where the heart is, goes the famous saying, and often it is true. As for the home of the advisor, well, his heart was a dark one, and his home made that clear. About 30 miles north from the center of Griffyngrein, the advisor had created his underground abode. The only visible part of this residence was its roof, two great stone slabs that sloped up to a harsh point. On one side, a channel had been cut downwards into the earth, leading to a heavy black door at least 10 feet below ground level. There, cut in large, forbidding letters, was the name of the house, Blackhearth. On either side of the doorway, there stood a Terfung sentry. They were both still and silent, and their expressions were dull and stony. They were hideously ugly creatures. A description of one of these sentries will give you an idea of the general appearance of the species. He was about 6 feet tall at the crown of his head, but his overall profile was much taller. From his head there rose a large, thick-stemmed, mushroom-like growth that was over 2 feet tall. This was no hat. This was a part of the creature's body, and its basic structure branched from his skull. The top of the mushroom had a diameter of a little less than 3 feet. It was a dirty white color with dull red blotches. It looked like a giant version of the poisonous mushrooms that grow in our world. The Terfung had a swarthy, dirty face with rough whiskers, a large, blobby nose, and heavy-lidded eyes. His uniform of scarlet garments and gleaming armor looked out of place on him, and unkempt, as if he didn't understand how to maintain such finery. He held a heavy, cruel spear, and a deadly curved dagger hung from his waist. Every now and then he and the other Terfung would glance at each other. It was clear, from their expressions at such times, that although they might enjoy a drink together, and although they worked together daily, they did not trust each other even the smallest bit, and didn't really care if they ever saw one another again. The sullen silence was now interrupted by footsteps crunching in the leaves, approaching the top of the channel rapidly. In a moment, a Terfung officer, or Quishag, came thumping down the lane, looking a little disturbed about something, and moving a bit faster than was customary for a Terfung on a dreary, eventless afternoon such as this. The spears of the two Terfung guards came clashing together in front of the officer's nose. "What's your business?" barked the one on the right. The Quishag growled. "Out of my way! I'm straight from lookout duty on Iron Hill, and I've got an important message for the advisor. You'll both be roasted alive if I don't get it to him quick enough." The two guards scrutinized him for a moment, but they both knew his face, and the fact that he carried important news for the advisor, who was merciless to those who inconvenienced him, was in his favor. They nodded at each other and snapped back to attention, hauling open the great black door. The front room, hung with fiercely elaborate tapestries and furnished with several outlandish statues, was very dimly lit, but the Quishag knew from previous experience that it was the brightest room in Blackhearth. He turned to the left, following a long, narrow hallway that sloped ever downwards. At the end of this hallway, he turned left again, and went down another sloping hallway. His pace slowed as he neared his destination. It was no pleasant job to visit the advisor under any circumstances, and he had a feeling that this particular message would not please his master at all, which would make things worse. But he had to keep moving, and soon he had arrived. The hallway ended with another heavy black door. The Terfung officer approached it very softly. He hesitated for a moment, and an unwilling shudder went up his spine. But then, scowling at his own cowardice, he knocked. "Who goes there?" asked a muffled Terfung voice from directly on the other side of the door. "It is Quishag Pug at His Majesty's service with a message for His Majesty," he answered as loudly as he dared. After a pause, the door opened slowly. Pug stepped in, and the door shut behind him. It made a sealing noise as it closed, as if it was designed to completely isolate those inside from the world around them. It was eerily quiet. The servant who had answered his knock was standing motionless against the door. One very small, very pale candle shivered in a wall bracket near him. It was the only light in the room. By its uncertain, frightened light, the corner of a large, dark tapestry could be seen on the wall. It was one of many in this horrid room, but only the advisor, whose eyes were accustomed to the darkness, could see them in their entirety. Further into the room, several layers of thick, inky black curtain were hung from wall to wall, concealing a large portion of the room from sight. Somewhere on the other side of that curtain was the advisor, and none of his subjects who had ever seen him before had any desire for him to come out. Pug cleared his throat. Your Highness, I came from my post on Iron Hill bearing news. There was a dreadful pause, but when the answer came, it made the silence more desirable. The advisor's voice was a cruel, cold but smoking, raspy, hair-raising sound. Speak on, and be quick. Pug swallowed. We saw something strange today, Your Majesty. Everything had been normal all day, but at about 4 in the afternoon, the unit on the south side of the hill spotted something way off in the distance. It was that wretched tower, you see. It what? Demanded the voice tensely. It was trembling, Your Majesty. Don't know why. It looked like there was an earthquake coming through, but the ground wasn't shaking on Iron Hill and never did. A couple of the Queeshags say that they saw some sort of flash like lightning, but only a couple of them. Anyway, I was sent right away to tell you in case it was important. There was a pause. Then Pug heard a long, terrible hiss. The tower. Trembling, the voice said softly. I knew it. I have felt it in my bones for hours now. Something is wrong. There was another hiss. Something is wrong. Finally, Queeshag, the advisor snapped. At your service, Pug gasped. Take this command to Goff Barthel. The 6th Patrol must march to the tower at once. They must not delay for a moment. Every second they delay will result in the death of one of his troops. A death I will oversee personally. Yes, sir. They must surround the tower, surrounded on all sides, in tight formation. They must do whatever they can to beat that door down, or pull the tower apart. They must not let anyone come out of that tower without capturing them. Any living being in the area must be captured. Do not kill any of them yet. They must be brought to me. Now go, and do not fail. Right away, sir. The officer fled from the room. The only sound left was the advisor's hissing in the darkness. Jane and Jason and their Griffyngrein friends were now exploring the top of the tower. Axman said that nobody had been up there in all the years he had been alive, and perhaps for generations before that. We need to look around carefully, Jerem said. I think it's possible that you'll find something very helpful up here. What do you mean? Jane asked. It's rumored that King Orowin, when he built this tower, had special items laid away up here, for the same reason he and the Griffins laid the great magic in its construction. He seemed to know somehow that evil would befall Griffyngrein one day, centuries after his death. I guess the Griffins told him. So he took great care to prepare for it, so that his beloved kingdom would have hope. Well, that over there looks promising, Jason said, pointing to a great stone chest that stood against the battlement. They walked over to it. Jane and Jason knelt down in front of it. It seemed to be fused to the floor. Jason tried lifting the lid, but it wouldn't budge. There was no lock or latch visible anywhere on the chest. What happens when each of you puts a hand on the lid? Jerem suggested after they had fiddled with it for some time. They tried it, laying their right hands on the cold stone. Slowly it warmed to their touch, and then a stream of silver ran along the border. On the lid itself, there rapidly appeared elaborate, beautiful silver designs, where before it had been blank. They heard a click and felt the lid jolt. Jane tried to lift the lid, but it was very heavy. Jason grasped it, and together they pushed it open slowly. All of them gathered close to look. Inside there were several items swathed in crimson cloth. Jerem lifted one long bundle out. His eyes widened, and he rested the object on the edge of the chest. "I believe I know what this is," he said, his tone awe-stricken. He pulled the cloth off and let it fall to the floor, revealing an object so bright that for a moment it blinded them. The natives gazed in astonishment. "It's the sword of the kingdom," Jerem cried. "Many legends have been told of it, ever since Orwin first had it crafted by the greatest smiths in Griffyngrein. This sword was not forged just for Orwin. It was made for the kingdom. Its duty is to always protect Griffyngrein in the hands of whatever man or woman is meant to wield it. Its edge never dulls. It never rusts. It never disintegrates over centuries of use. Take it, Jason. Hurry, it's getting too heavy to hold." Jerem held it out urgently to Jason. The boy had never held a real sword in his life, but he found himself hastily grasping the hilt. To his surprise, it didn't feel heavy at all. He lifted it up high, and it flashed in the sunlight. Jerem chuckled with astonishment, shaking his head. "With one hand he's holding it up, like it's nothing." Axman nodded gravely. "Aye, Jerem. There cannot be a shade of doubt now. The sword responds to his touch." Jason was barely listening. He was gazing at the sword. On its hilt were 3 blue gems of the same color as the bondstone, a bit smaller than marbles, arranged in the shape of a triangle, with interwoven lines engraved from one to the other to complete the shape. On the blade itself, in thin, fine, elaborate strokes, an intricate design ran almost its full length on both sides. Jerem took a silver belt and sheath out of the folds of the scarlet cloth that had enclosed the sword. The blue gem triangle was fixed on both of them. "What is this symbol?" Jason asked, as he fastened the belt on and sheathed his sword. "I'm not sure," Jerem said, studying them. "I've seen it before on very old artifacts and manuscripts. No one has used it in recent years, but apparently it was important in the ancient days." They turned their attention to the contents of the chest again. Jerem lifted out a small bundle and undid the ribbon that tied it together. There, lying in the middle of the cloth, was a silver ring. It featured a silver structure shaped like a cone from which the top half, including the point, had been removed. The sides of this cone were covered with engravings. There was a small hole in the top, the rim of which was lined with tiny blue gems. It was a curious but handsome piece. "Ah, I know what this is," Axman spoke up. "Jane, this will be for you. It's just the right thing. It goes on your middle finger. Very handy in times like this." "What is it for?" Jane asked, slipping it onto her right hand. Surprisingly, it fit perfectly. "Run your finger around that circle of gems." Jane traced the gems, and they glimmered under her touch. "Now aim it. No, that way, into the trees. Make a fist and squeeze your fingers against the ring." Jane obeyed him, and there was a flash. Everyone jumped as a thin stream of blue light shot from the ring. It raced towards the trees where Jane had pointed her fist. There was a sizzle, and a branch dropped to the ground with a crash, leaving a smoking stub behind. Jane released her grasp, her mouth falling open. Axman grinned. "That ring will give you some stout protection, ma'am. The ray is powerful. It can penetrate most any material." "How do you know about it, Axman? I've never seen one before," Jerem said, looking at his comrade with surprise. "An old man I used to know, when I was hiding in the northern mountains as a boy, had a ring like this. He was a mysterious old fellow, but he was kind to me, and he showed me how his ring worked. He never said where or how he found it, but I've never forgotten it. Oh, and Jane, to keep from shooting it accidentally, you should deactivate it by tracing the stones again when you don't need it." Jane smiled. "Not something you'd find at the local jewelry store," she remarked as she followed Axman's advice. They unwrapped the next item in the chest. It was a large, beautiful, leather-bound book. Handsome designs had been tooled on the smooth, glossy binding, along with the title, which was simply A Book of Healing. Jason leafed through the pages. Time had not worn or marred them, but they were nevertheless clearly ancient. "It looks like a lot of medical information and instructions for cures," he said. "Wounds, illnesses, headaches, the remedies are all here." Jane sucked in her breath and reached out both hands for the book. Jason grinned and handed it to her. "Tailor-made for you," he said. "Yes, indeed," Jane said, beaming. "There is no telling how useful this will be." Jason lifted out the next object, which was quite large. He pulled back the cloth, revealing a magnificent shield that matched his sword and belt. It bore no emblem, but the face of it was very bright, and so polished that it mirrored its surroundings perfectly. The final items in the chest were 2 identical bundles. Jane and Jason unwrapped them. Inside were 2 beautiful, floor-length hooded cloaks. Their color was very close to that of the bondstone. They looked brand new. Surely these can't be that old, Jane said, running her hand across the soft material. But they are, Jerem said. Centuries old. They have been preserved in this chest ever since it was first put here, just like the other items. I wonder why there just happened to be 2 of them, Jason said, looking at the empty chest. Jerem smiled and shrugged. I don't know, any more than I know why the ring fit Jane, or why the sword belt and the shield seem to be made especially to suit your build. I've tried to study what history and folklore I can in my spare time, but we Hookies don't have many books in our village. We've passed down pieces of our history, sometimes in songs and chants. That's how I know most of what I've told you today. But there's a lot about the tower and the magic here that's a mystery, and I know only the basics. They look like they're straight out of the royal wardrobe, Jane said. This material is the highest quality I've ever seen. They don't match the clothes we're wearing now, that's for sure, Jason said. Jerem nodded. That reminds me, when we take you to our village, we will get you some new clothes made as soon as possible. Those you're wearing surely won't last you for very long. My jeans will, Jason said firmly, his hands going automatically into his pockets. I'm keeping the jeans. We're going to your village? Jane asked. Yes, at least that's what I was going to propose to Rainiff when he... Jerem paused. Wait a minute. Rainiff? Jason paused. Yeah, where is he? He said he would meet us at the tower. But didn't he say that might not be until after the test? Jane asked. He did, but we've been up here a good while. Besides, more time has passed than he anticipated because you 2 ran off, Axman said. He should be here. He might just be waiting outside the door. You locked it, remember? Jason said to Jerem. Believe me, that wouldn't keep him out. We need to look for him, Axman said grimly. Something must be wrong.